Thank you. All right, let's keep going. My name is Vinay. I'm originally from Chennai. I currently live and work in Boston. I work at a company called Whoop. I've been doing front end for about 15 years, mostly in e-commerce, and that's what I do for them too. I handle their websites, help with the e-commerce stuff. There's a bunch of links in this talk. If you go to my website, you can find a link. You can find my email, and then you can email me, and I'll send you the slides, so you don't have to take pictures if you don't want to. The very interesting thing about me, or I think the most interesting thing about me, is I have 3 dogs and 2 cats that are not in this picture. And I do a lot of stray animal rescue work, both in Boston and in Chennai. If you don't find the technical aspect of this talk interesting, please come talk to me about stray animals, and I'll talk your ears off. All right, let's address the elephant in the room. The title of this talk is clickbait, right? I deliberately did it. Here's some other working titles I had. I was like, Cloudflare ruined my Next.js deployment. It just sounds really harsh. I don't work for Cloudflare. I don't work for a Cloudflare competitor. This is really, it's not a hit piece on Cloudflare. I'm just trying to share my experiences working on the platform, and really what I would tell you if you were to step aside and talk about my experience. That's really what this talk is intended at. I have a lot of respect for the team. We have like regular sync up, so I'm not doing this outside of their permission. So the overarching theme of my talk really is buy versus build. As a developer, you're going to keep running into this time and again. And I want to share what we did in a specific context, but also towards the end, I kind of wanted to share a framework for making decisions the next time you run into a buy versus build conversation. Really, the spectrum, the 2 ends of the spectrum for hosting Next.js is you can get something out of the box that helps do all the tough things for you, like Netlify, Cloudflare pages that we'll see, Vercel. And then on the other end of the spectrum is like just doing it yourself, Docker, Kubernetes, all of that. Obviously, like no one really likes doing that, and I'm not any different, so I kind of went with this. This is the specific project that we're going to be talking about. It's Cloudflare has a product called Pages that's really geared towards Jamstack websites, but then all frameworks are adding more server-side functionality now, and so they have a way where they can take your output from your build, your Next.js build, where they've recently introduced like a static output API, and what that essentially does is provides infrastructure as code for what a provider needs to do with the output from your build. So some of them are static files that can be thrown on a CDN, and then some things need to be either on a node server or an edge server. And so that's really what it does. This command line tool takes your output, and then Cloudflare, as you might be aware, they have a whole bunch of data centers across the globe. And so what you get is the edge caching with the CDN, and then edge compute. So your server-side code runs really as close to the user as possible. I think the metric is something like under 4 milliseconds a user usually can reach a Cloudflare server. So I kind of divided the talk into 3 parts, good, bad, and ugly. And let's talk about the good parts of using Cloudflare next on Pages. Wrangler is their command line tool. And it's the developer experience using that tool is phenomenal. It's not specific to Pages. It's for all Cloudflare products. You can spin up a new instance, tear it down, view logs, all through the command line without having to go to the UI at all. And I think that experience is really nice. And specific to Pages, Wrangler allows you to do a direct deploy or direct upload, which is essentially take your files and send it to Cloudflare and then distribute it across the edge network. Really reminds me of FileZilla. I don't know how many of you are old enough to have used FileZilla. It's really like a drag and drop where one side is your local, the other side is a server. The Wrangler experience is very, very similar to that. It's like in a matter of seconds, your Next.js app can be live across the globe. The other part that gets unlocked because the deploys are really fast is it enables continuous deployment. So if deployments are trivial, you can just keep deploying through the day. And so that's kind of what it enables. We are on a trunk-based deployment where you branch off of main, you make your changes, merge to main, it auto-deploys to production. And the other really nice thing that comes out of the box is the deploy previews. I think all vendors provide this, but I really want to call out how useful it is to have a separate sandbox for every developer. They have a URL that they can share with QA or PM, and there's no real work that you need to do for any of this. It comes for free. And what the deploy previews do is every commit is a unique URL, and so that enables rollbacks to be instant. All you're doing is pointing to an older deployment in time and say, let's route production traffic to the older one. And I think that's all of this is really phenomenal. So this very scientific chart that I drew is trying to tell you that initially you get a real spike in productivity when you're using an out-of-the-box solution, and you're kind of just off to the races. And I really want to talk about like the initial stages of the project. You're not trying to figure out how to get my code on a URL, what needs to be exposed, who gets access to it. All of that just works out of the box. Let's talk about the bad parts. The edge runtime is a requirement. What does that mean? We saw that they have a bunch of edge locations where they can deploy your code. And so Next.js has this this line of code that you need to provide in your page to say, this is not running on Node.js, which is the other option. This is running on edge. And that tells Next.js whatever it needs to know about your code. And one thing to note about the edge runtime is whatever your code is running on is not Node.js. It's Cloudflare Workers, it's its own runtime. And I think that's problematic in a few instances. They do try to bridge the gap, so they keep trying to get Node.js compatibility closer. It's not at 100%, but they keep improving. But then you run into certain use cases where that can be problematic. Kind of continuing the theme of clickbait, I kind of want to touch on caching with Next.js in general is problematic. So I found a couple videos and I thought this was interesting. Like Next.js 15 ruins caching even more. I'm not here to talk about how bad it is. It is a complicated situation, but there is a way to opt out of it, right? If you don't want Next.js to do any caching, you can say, listen, I'll handle the caching. I know what to do. I don't want you to do anything. And so you can opt out of it by using this option called cache no store. React extends fetch. Next.js extends fetch. But this is a native fetch implementation. It's part of the request object. And so you pass this option, and in theory, it should know not to cache your requests, except it doesn't work. There's a bug in the implementation where Cloudflare Workers does not respect or understand that property, and so any fetch calls with that option will automatically fail. In addition, there's like size limitations. When we originally started implementing it, there was a 5 megabyte size limitation. Understandable, if you want your code to be living on the edge, you don't want it to be infinitely huge. But also, all frameworks are moving towards server-side code. So I want to move from shipping 10 megabyte bundles to the client to have the option to ship 10 megabyte bundles to the server. But having like an arbitrary limitation like that can be a blocker for some folks. We had one legacy project that we were trying to move over and really quickly hit the 5 megabyte limit. And we didn't get enough clear error messaging as to why that was a problem. I had to dig around to figure it out. So the next thing I wanted to point out is environment variables, something you take for granted in a lot of situations. That can be problematic too with Cloudflare in this specific product. .env is a standard accepted practice for environment variables, but the Cloudflare worker that gets created as part of your Pages project doesn't understand it. So you either have to, the documentation's lacking, there's an open bug to fix it, where you either have to prefix it with next public, which means all your server-side environment variables get exposed to the client bundles, or you have to use a Wrangler TOML file, which is like a workaround. I think in general, it's okay if you can't read what's in here. In general, the experience with the Cloudflare Pages product is that it introduces like this bifurcation in your head. Is my code running on Node or is my code running on Cloudflare? Is this a problem with my code? Is it a problem with the implementation? And so every debugging, you're kind of going through multiple paths of that. And there is a way to locally mimic what Cloudflare does. But I was talking to someone else. We don't do it. We use Next.js straight up. And then I was talking to someone else that also uses Cloudflare. And they're like, we don't use it either. And so maybe that can be better documented or recommended stronger. I wanted to also share like a small story with you guys. And you'd have to use your imagination a little for this because I have no screenshots. We had a time sale at our company where, let's say at 9 a.m. Indian Standard Time, the sale needs to be turned off for all users. And so all of our backend services know to not honor the sale beyond that specific time. But then what we realized was we turned it off, and we know there's an API call from the UI that checks if the sale is on or not. But then even though that's returning the correct response, the UI was still stale. And so this is a production fire. We're showing a promotion to users that we cannot honor. They're going through the funnel, and then they're being hit with, this is not a valid promotion. And so we're trying to debug this, right? And so it's very clear there's some kind of caching going on, and we need to invalidate it. So we're figuring out what can we do? What can we do? And so first thing is, can I invalidate the cache using the UI? The answer is no. So you can invalidate if you have straight up worker. If you have a worker that gets created through the Pages product, you don't have the option to invalidate the UI. And if your domain is not hosted on Cloudflare, you can't invalidate the cache through the UI either. So it's just not possible. What else can we do, right? We're like, without looking this up, real quick pop quiz for you folks. If I have code like this and this is the entirety of the code, when does this get cached in Next.js? It's OK. You don't have to think. I'll tell you the answer. It gets cached at build time, right? So if you don't provide anything, it gets cached at build time. And so the next theory is, well, can I rebuild and redeploy, and will that invalidate the cache? And so it turns out the cache with Next.js is so powerful that it persists across deployments, right? So you rebuild, you redeploy, the API is giving the right response, but my UI is still stale. And I'm not able to invalidate the cache in any manner. And so what's the next thing? We already saw they don't have the ability to opt out of cache using the no store, so that's not a possibility. What else can I do, right? Next.js has this concept of on-demand revalidation. There's time-based and then on-demand, which is essentially like an API route that you can hit and say, can you please invalidate cache for a specific route? And it does that. And so we deploy this code, and then we use this API. We trigger a cache invalidation. And then that works, right? Everything's OK. Huge sigh of relief. I don't see the stale UI anymore. It's fine. But then after a while, I'm like, something doesn't feel right. What's going on? And then it turns out, because it's deployed on the edge, when you call the API from one data center, it clears the cache for that data center. So myself and any other user that hits that one specific data center gets fresh UI. And then literally everyone else is still seeing the stale UI. And so we're like, what is the real solution here, right? Eventually what worked was we had to fake a query parameter in the URL to kind of tell Next.js to not cache it anymore. And that's what really worked. And so we bubbled this up to the Cloudflare team, and we were like, listen, this is kind of problematic. What do you think we can do? And one of their ideas was you can use a key value store. It's another product from Cloudflare that's also globally cached, but then the invalidation destroys the cache across the globe. So it kind of solves the problem, but my vendor lock-in senses are tingling, right? I don't want to solve one problem by purchasing another product. And so we ended up using our query parameter method. And so I wanted to talk about the ugly parts. And I want to kind of caveat this by saying ugly is subjective, right? What's a deal breaker for me can be a minor inconvenience for you. But I'll still mention everything that I think is relevant, and you can make an informed decision. I think the biggest problem for me is the Pages product is not congruous with the rest of Cloudflare's offerings. It doesn't look the same. It doesn't function the same. Underneath, it's a worker, but you don't really have control over it. For example, logging and observability. With Cloudflare Workers, there is a way to get your logs out of Cloudflare into Splunk or some other tool like that, but you cannot do that with the Pages product because they haven't built it yet. Same thing with Sentry integration, Datadog integration. If you have a straight-up worker file, you have all of these integrations working fine, but then when you do it as part of the Pages product, you don't have any of these. And there's a bunch of breakages that can be caused because of internal dependencies. This command line internally calls the Vercel command line, and they publish newer versions pretty often. And because this dependency is not shrink wrapped to a specific version, you kind of get co-opted into the most latest version of Vercel. So you're running your build, and sometimes it randomly fails because Vercel made a publish, and you're kind of stuck for a few hours not being able to deploy code to production. And it's kind of like a GitHub issue that talks about this problem, and you can follow the conversation along. The other thing, this is actually a feature and not a bug, but it's the Cloudflare Workers is extremely sensitive to resource leaks because again, it's a trade-off, right? It's at the edge. It's very resource sensitive. There's a really nice article that I've linked here that talks about like sometimes you can't guarantee that promises will resolve. And Cloudflare doesn't like that. When you have a dangling promise, it doesn't like it. Your code does not deploy, your build fails. And the error you get is kind of cryptic, and there's a lot of people complaining about it, and you'll eventually find the source of the problem, but there's conversations about how they can make it better. So, and then I think the last thing, which is really important for open source projects, is documentation, right? The real documentation for this project lives inside GitHub in Markdown files, which is fine. But then like some parts of it are on the documentation website, and they're not matching one-to-one. And then there's other parts that you can kind of find in the community discussions that they're not anywhere official. It's just people talking to each other. And so really, you kind of had this spike in productivity initially, and then you hit an inflection point where you've kind of extracted as much value out of this, and you're kind of discovering edge cases, and productivity starts going down. And you're in a soup because you've kind of tightly coupled yourself with this tool. And so really, if you ask me today what I would do, even though like the Kubernetes problem is complex, I think it makes more sense to have control over your infrastructure. So if something is wrong, you can quickly check what's going on and be able to swap things out. And so before I wrap up, I kind of wanted to touch on this buy versus build framework. So the next time you have a discussion with someone and you're like, do I just buy a solution? Do I just throw money at the problem? You're like, really list out what are the needs of your project and be very honest about it. Like, it's not what you would like to have. It's not what you want. It's really what does this project require? And then see what the framework or whatever the solution is offering. This advice is generic intentionally, right? Like if there's a bunch of features anything is offering and it overlaps really well with what you need, then that's a no-brainer. You can take it and go on. If not, for example, in this scenario, edge compute was not really a requirement for us. It was one of their top features, and it was a nice to have for us, but then that was the root cause of a lot of our problems. And the other thing you can think of is switching cost, right? If you pick a vendor for something like A/B tests or feature flags, and you're not happy with that vendor, it's pretty trivial to switch it out. Whereas if you're picking a vendor for your deployments, you're kind of stuck with them and all of the issues that come with that decision. And so I think that's the end of my talk. I know this is after lunch session, so some people are like, this could have totally been a blog post. There is a really nice blog post that someone else wrote. I didn't have time for a blog post, so I made this talk. But they're also listing all of their grievances in using this product. And I think if you're considering it, I would really give this a look and see if it makes sense to you. And kind of to wrap up, the Cloudflare team is aware of all of this. And they're working on a new adapter that gives you 100% node compatibility, but it's in super alpha stage. But this is kind of how open source works. If you're interested, try it out, give them some feedback, and hopefully they'll make a better product. And so with that, I'll end my talk. Thank you so much.